Welcome back, everyone, to Come Let Us Reason Together. I'm bringing on my friend Matthew Lee Anderson. Matt has been a great individual to stir your thoughts, to stir your hearts and your minds in all aspects of tough questions. Matt doesn't shy away from the tough questions. In fact, he wrote a book about questions, which is a little backwards. Normally, people write books to answer questions, but he wrote a book about making them. Today, we're talking about his book, Called Into Questions, which is an interesting approach. So I hope you enjoy this discussion with Matthew Lee Anderson on Come Let Us Reason Together. Good day, everyone. Welcome to another Come Let Us Reason Together podcast. I'm Lenny, and today I'm very excited to introduce you to Matthew Lee Anderson. Now, if you don't know Matt, he's been around for quite some time. He is the Associate Director for the Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion. He's an associate fellow for the McDonald Center for Theology, Ethics, and Public Life at Oxford University. That's where he received his PhD in Christian ethics. He's an alumnus of Biola University, being one of the Torrey's honors program graduates, one of the very first ones, if I remember right, back in the day. And that's actually where I first met him. We did a couple of dinners together with some of those guys. And he's also the founder of Mere Orthodoxy. That's been an online magazine that's been around since 2005 and writes for Mere Fidelity, the Gospel Coalition, Christianity Today, so many others. And so, Matthew, welcome to the program. Glad to have you here.
Thanks very much. I'm glad to be here. I'm always intrigued by how people introduce me, what they say about me. You know, a gadfly, someone who just irritates people. That's, all true. Will not deny.
Provocateur was the word I was going to use, but I thought that initially that might not sit as well as some people may think. But you'll see why, I think, folks, when we start talking about your book Called Into Questions. First of all, you came out of the classical understanding, the classically trained program, reading kind of the rich history of humanity and things like that. What drew you to these ideas of Christian ethics and stuff? Because I'm sure, and I think you say it a little bit in the book, that you didn't start off this way.
Yeah. No, it's true. I was a graduate of Torrey Honors College at Biola University, and Torrey Honors, it's a great program. I spent 1,000 hours, something like that, as an undergraduate, just in classes, reading old texts and talking with peers about them, asking questions of each other, asking questions of the text, trying to find answers. And I was originally drawn to the program simply on the basis of the reading list. I just had this sense. I remember seeing a brochure for the program for the first time, and where they listed all the books that we would read. And I just had this sense as I was in high school that if I wanted to be a wise person, I needed to read figures and thinkers that were not from within our own time period. A lot of that was reading C.S. Lewis in middle school and high school, and just feeling like there's something weird here. Like there's some sort of depth of insight that I don't feel like I'm getting in a lot of my daily life. Like he sees things a little bit differently, and thinking about what sort of books that he read. And so looking at that, seeing the reading list and thinking, oh man, if I really want to understand the world, these are the books that I just have to read them. Like there's no getting around it. If I don't read these books, I'm never gonna understand how things are going. Now that's a little bit false, but that was what drew me originally to that program, and what inducted me into this way of thinking and of valuing questions.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, and it's a shame that we lose a lot of that. People think that it's a chore sometimes to read what they would consider as antiquated. There's the fallacious idea, the bias of the historical past, right? That whatever's newer is better. And that's certainly not true, because that's never how we learn and understand things that we're trying to do. If you want to get better at something, you practice at it. You fix your mistakes. And humanity, hopefully, tries to do that to some degree. So if we jettison the past, how in the world can we do that? But so you're into now Christian ethics. That's your kind of your sweet spot. But we talk about a lot of bioethical issues. I know that we've had those discussions before and things like that. So what makes you write a book about questions? How does this come about?
Yeah, some of it is just a personal journey I've been on over the last 15 years, trying to understand what I'm doing as a thinking Christian. What is it that I'm trying to do when I engage my faith on an intellectual level? You know, about a decade ago, there was when I was a young man, when I was still a young man, there were a bunch of evangelicals around who were talking a lot about doubt and defending doubt, saying doubt is a really important part of the Christian life. We've got to doubt everything. And I was never really into that. I think that doubt is a complicated phenomenon, but not something that the New Testament really looks on with a lot of esteem or praise. And so I actually wrote a version of this book then that was pretty personal and that tried to say no to doubting, but to try to say, here's actually positively, constructively what the Christian intellectual life should or look like or feel like. Like it should be one of engaging questions and questioning. And that's very different than doubting. You know, in the last few years, we've heard a lot about deconstructing.
Right.
Yeah, as a process. And I have a similar sort of assessment of that I did about doubting. Like there's something that they're reacting to, the people who are deconstructing, that is important. And I want to take their experiences very seriously. But I'm also a little skeptical that the deconstructing program as a method is the right way to approach the intellectual life as Christians, or even as people who are leaving Christianity.
Yeah.
And so I thought, you know, there's still a need for thinking about constructively, positively, what is the right disposition to have as Christians when it comes to how we understand the world. And it seems to me that the answer there is we have a lot of questions and we seek answers to those questions, which I realize is ironic, right? Like Christians are answers people. We you know, like that's what we do. And certainly in the apologetics world, which I know you've been a part of for a very long time, right? Like the answers that's where the action's at.
Yeah, I highlighted that section of your book actually when you were starting to say, well, it's not that it's apologetics that's the problem; it's the silver bullet thinking that's the problem.
Yeah, and you know, like, and apologetics has been a terrific gateway drug.
Yeah.
For a lot of Christians into the intellectual life. Like it's been immensely valuable. But it's not like providing answers to those who have questions is not the first movement of the Christian intellectual life.
That's right.
We have to be ready to do it. But the first movement of the Christian intellectual life is this interest in understanding and seeking understanding. And that means that we've got to have some questions that we are wrestling with ourselves that are just our questions. And that's really what I tried to unpack. What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it mean to have questions as Christians? And how is that different than doubting? How is that different than deconstructing? How is that different than these other options that are out there?
Okay, yeah, that's great. And there's a whole lot there that I want to explore. First of all, I would say that if you talk to folks who have done defense of the faith for a long time, they will tell you that questions are actually the first step even in that aspect. I often tell the story of a Jehovah's Witness lady who came to my door. Actually, she came on Thursday. I wasn't home. My son answered the door. And she said, "Is your father home? I could talk to him." He says, "No, he's not. But can you come back on Saturday? Because I know that he'd like to talk to you, right?" And he said that because Saturday was my birthday. He hadn't gotten me anything yet, so got me a Jehovah's Witness. But she came back, and we first engaged, and I say, "I understand, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. I understand a little bit about your belief system and that you don't believe that Jesus is God, right?" And we start conversing about that a little bit. And I said, "Well, wait a minute. Have you always been a Jehovah's Witness?" And she said, "Well, no." I said, "Well, there's a lot of faiths out there. Why would you choose that one?" And she tells me her story. Now, her story was that she had an older brother, several years her senior, who she loved dearly, but that brother had mental health issues. He had something that was genetic that caused him to act out. And she said in ways that were just unspeakable. Actually, he'd fly out, he'd get terrible fits and things like that. But I love my brother. Eventually, when he was into his young adult years, he physically succumbed. He passed away because of this illness. And she goes, and that just really broke me because I loved my brother. And I knew he couldn't be in heaven given the things he did. But I couldn't believe, and I didn't want to believe that he would suffer in hell. So I started a religious quest. And after several years, lo and behold, I found the Jehovah's Witnesses and that they taught the truth. Now, if you understand that the witnesses believe in annihilationism, that the soul doesn't suffer in hell, you start to put a couple of things together. And my point to people is, now, should I go on and talk about Granville Sharp's rules of Greek grammar and whether you start using an indefinite article with God or a, is that going to make any difference at this person at all? Or do I talk about mercy and forgiveness and love and how questions are key to our interactions, even with non-believers. And it's where we should start with ourselves, as I agree that you say, but also with other people. And I think that's an important point. And what you say, even Socrates, right, is the model. He's the guy who all he did was ask questions, and he was considered the smartest man in Athens because he knew that he didn't know anything. He needed to ask, he needed to uncover, which I think is the kind of the introduction to the book that you have here. And you have a chapter on doubt and how questioning, but it's not gainsaying. It's not questioning for the sake of questioning. There's a difference, and you draw that out, that there needs to be a questioning motivated like a 3-year-old does who really wants to understand, right? So
yeah.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I think your story is a good one, and is indicative of the type of questioning that I'm interested in, right? Like where you actually have a real person and you really want to understand that person, right? And there's a recognition of uncertainty or ignorance, right? This person has motivations. They've got all sorts of reasons for what they believe, and whether or not you enter into a dialogue about the value of those reasons, that question means that you get to walk together on a path in which you are able to become friends for that period of time, and you're able to think together. And that's the question I think is really valuable. And when you say we should do that with ourselves, that's I think what I'm trying to get to, right? Like feeling the questions where I recognize I've got some uncertainty. I just don't understand. I think a lot about, and I read about in the book, Mary's question when the angel comes to her and says, you're going to give birth to the Messiah. Her question is, how will this thing be? And that how question is it's a perfect question. It's a very simple question. She's just confused. She's perplexed by this news that she's received. And she wants to understand how it's going to go. She's not doubting the angel's word. She's not rejecting it. She just really wants to understand what is going to happen to her and how this thing is going to come about. And I think that's a paradigmatic moment of an appropriate question, the sort of question that as Christians we should ask. We have a very bizarre faith, right? Like the claims that we make about the world, we should just all recognize they're really absurd, right? Like God, the infinite, almighty, omnipotent, all-knowing, right? Like all these omnis, becomes a human. And this human being, Jesus Christ, has two natures. He's fully God and fully man. But it's a mess if you step back and think about it. Like it's just a totally bizarre thing
Yeah.
that we are saying about the world. And if we are not ourselves perplexed by the truth claims that we are affirming and striving to understand them better, then I think we're not living out the fullness of the Christian intellectual life. And that's the sort of question that I want us to ask. The questions out of perplexity, the questions out of confusion, the questions out of some deep desire that we have to understand ourselves, our faith, the person in front of us, because I think that those questions are very valuable and very hard to get to, actually. Like a lot of people ask questions as challenges, you know.
Right. And you contrast Mary with, of course, Eliezer, John the Baptist's father. Yep. Yeah, you say so here's two different questions, but the questions, although they sound alike, the motivations are far different. The priest should have known better. If you're serving in the temple and this is happening in God's house with your knowledge, you should know that, and your faith commitments are such that you should be building upon those. And he seemed to be regressing where she's 13 and saying, wait a minute, I know the mechanics have this, but that's not going to work because it's not me. So how do I understand it?
Yeah, that's right. We see a similar sort of problem with Nicodemus in John 3, right? How can I re-enter my mother's womb and be born again? Like he's just confused. Like, how is it possible is Nicodemus's question. He doesn't actually believe that it's possible to be born again. And so there's a hint of disbelief. There's a hint of a denial of God's omnipotence. Whereas Mary has none of that. She's just like, how will this be? Tell me how this is going to happen, because I really would like to know. If I'm going to be the one who gives birth to the Messiah, I think I would like to know how that's going to happen, since I have never known a man, she says, Yeah. And I think like that question to understand it's just a delightful stance to have towards the world. I'll just say my other favorite example of this in the Gospels is Thomas, in the Gospel of John. Just a hilarious moment, right before Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." He says, "I'm going to the Father, and you know the way in which I am going." Like Jesus just tells everyone in the room, tells all the disciples, "And you know the way that I'm going." And Thomas is like, I mean, you can just imagine him looking around the room being like, he just said that we know the way. I didn't get the memo, right? And so Thomas asked this really quote unquote dumb question. It's like, I don't know the way. Like, what's the way, Jesus? Where are you going and how do we get there?
It's very much like the teacher doing the algebra problem on the blackboard. All the kids are just stymied, right? But there's only one who's brave enough to say, I don't get that.
I don't get it. Thomas is like, I'm a dummy. If you're going there, what's the way? And you get Jesus's wonderful answer, right? Which we all learned in Sunday school or learned by heart, right? I am the way, the truth, and the life. This wonderful line that has been so significant to so many Christians across the years. It doesn't happen without Thomas being like, I don't really understand here. And I'm going to be the guy who asks the dumb question that everyone else probably has, but is a little afraid to ask. It's just, those are the questions that just make me really excited. When my students ask questions that they think are perfectly obvious because they're the questions that they have, and there's just something they don't understand that they feel the burden that they want to understand, it makes me so happy.
Yeah. So the book is it's a very interesting blend. There's some theology that runs throughout, of course, but it's not merely a strategy for growing in faith and growing in learning. It's also a little bit of a discipleship approach. You've got a little bit of that flavor in there too. And then of course you do have the survey of some of the great works, right? Dante you point to, of course, the Odyssey, and
Yeah.
you know,
A little bit of Shakespeare in there.
yeah, there's a little bit of Othello and some of these other pieces that you point to. So tell me, was that intentional on your part? Yeah, I mean, because I don't want people to think that this is just kind of a dry tome. That, you know, there's a lot of references to a lot of works and a lot of things that really, as you said, you first wrote the kind of prior version for yourself. And so there's a lot of personal things that are resonating in there. So can you tell me a little bit about more your strategy?
I'm glad to hear that. I'm not sure I have that considered of a strategy. Writing books it's hard. I'm not sure.
All you have to do is open up a vein and bleed, right? That's the
Yeah, that's right. That's right. When I thought about this book, I thought what might be good for an undergraduate specifically. Like how would an undergraduate be able to take up these sorts of questions, take up this book and benefit from it? So that's really who I had in mind, which means that I think there's some careful theological reflection happening at points within it. But I did try to make it as clean of prose as possible so that it reads in an engaging way, and tried to include I don't include a lot of personal anecdotes because I, for various reasons, try to shy away from that in my writing. I think that the reduction of Christian prose to people telling stories out of their own lives is not necessarily a healthy feature of our Christian intellectual landscape these days. So I have some resistance to that. So I don't tell a lot of personal stories in there, but I do tell some. And but I'm really trying to do it judiciously in ways that highlight for people really how questioning works. But it's a hard, like it was a rewrite of a book. So I was working in one respect with a pattern that was there a decade ago, and felt some limits from that in terms of what I should do. I didn't decide to rewrite it from the ground up, though it is a new book.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it makes sense, and we live in an age where people believe anecdote is evidence. And that's especially in the press. If you read every press story nowadays, it's fascinating. It used to be journalism was taught the first paragraph has the who, what, when, why, where, right? All the W's. And now it's the first paragraph is Marta is an immigrant lady who, and they tell a specific story. So they telegraph their bias prior to doing it. And as you say, this is not this is kind of common parlance now. It's not the fault of any one side. It's kind of how our culture has degenerated into soundbite concepts. So
yeah, and one thing that I really tried to do was write it in such a way that people would have some questions out of it, right? And I didn't. We like, all due respect, love my publisher, but there were noises that were made about putting study questions at the back of each chapter. And I was like, that's not going to happen. No. We are not going to do the study guide questions. And in part, like, I tried to write it in such a way that someone who would read it would internalize it, but then be a little bit confused at points. Right? We think that it's bad to be confused or perplexed in reading books, and it's bad for sales if people are confused or perplexed when they read books. But it's actually good for the people who read those books to be confused or perplexed. I mean, you mentioned the old books and the value of them and Lewis's line. I tell my students, I think that a lot of times with old books, it's just good to read them, even if you only understand 30% of them. Better to understand 30% of a old hard book than 100% of a book that's on the lowest shelf
Right.
that you can pull off. And so there's a little, like I go back and forth in terms of how accessible I'm making it. So there's a couple of moments, for instance, where I have long footnotes in this book, like almost
Half
full
page.
page.
Yeah.
They're big footnotes. And my publisher, God bless him, really wanted me to dial those footnotes back. And I was like, no, there's going to be a couple of readers who are interested in seeing how I'm thinking about this, where I show my work and raise a few more questions about those subjects in the footnotes, right? To try to drive people farther and to give them even more questions than they would have. So I really want people, I don't feel like this is the definitive guide to questioning well or living the question life. I actually think if it raises a lot of questions for people and they come away a little bit more perplexed about their intellectual lives than they were at the beginning, that's kind of a win in its own right.
Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, I had actually the biggest question I had was who's Emily, but that's
that is to be clear, that's a completely fictional name.
I figured that. I'm going, there's got to be a reference someplace in that I missed, and I was going backwards in pages, and so anyway.
No.
Yeah. We'll talk about that in a minute. So one of the things that, and you talk about how to start forming these questions. You talk about communities being places where you want to start forming questions as well with the church. And we had talked a little bit about apologetics, how apologetics does spur the impetus for thinking well and at least thinking clearly. But really it does take questions to organize that. So where would you say that someone should start? How do they start knowing how to form these right kinds of questions?
Well, they should read my book. That's the first thing they should do. That aside, that out of the way, I was thinking about this yesterday, actually, because we're at a point in the semester, I teach, and I've assigned final papers to my students. And one of my students said something like, I have no idea what to write on. And what they need to do, what my students need to do in order to write a paper is come up with a question in the first place. They've got to have something that they wonder about. And how do you do that? Well, you have to have enough space in your life to do that in the first place. It's very hard to come up with questions if you're constantly being bombarded with noise or even information. Unless you're a very good mental processor, and you can, like, you have already a very active intellectual life and you can think of questions while you're getting lots of noise, I think having space in your life to reflect on things is really valuable for coming up with questions. I think you have to internalize what you're reading. You can't just come up with questions out of the atmosphere, out of the ether and have them be good questions. I think reading books that generate questions for you, internalizing them, meditating on them, marinating in these books and allowing questions to come up from your resting with these books and allowing them to permeate. I think that's where many of our best questions come from. So those are two things, but those are both like slow, low tech ways of coming up with good questions. There's a little bit of a like anti-modern edge to the intellectual life that I think we need to cultivate in certain ways.
Yeah, I was wondering if the dialogues by Plato, I think, is a really good way to look at seeing a model of this in a written form where, a person makes a statement and that statement kind of sounds appropriate, but then you say, well, wait a minute, what about in this instance? Is that still true? And you see kind of the back and forth in all of those, and they're not terribly long. They might read a little more dry for a modern audience, but they really do draw out that kind of ethos.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if someone picked up like the Lakeys, which is a dialogue on courage, which is very short actually, and it's a good subject that lots of people are interested in. Question is, what is courage, or maybe manliness, depending on how people understand the opening term. It seems like a kind of obvious subject. But you can see one person gives an answer and then Socrates starts asking questions about the answer. And the number of questions he comes up with is genuinely extraordinary. Like by the end of the dialogue, you're just kind of tired of all the different questions and all the different ways in which you can go wrong in answering what courage is. And that sense of tiredness, I think, is very valuable intellectually, right? Like you want to, if you can have a question that you're thinking about and you're marinating in it, and you reach the point where you're exhausted with it, going and taking a walk is a very good thing, but continuing to have it in the back of your mind, it's a bit, the intellectual life, it's a bit like doing push-ups. Someone told me once, it's not the push-ups that you can do that count. It's the push-ups that you can't do, that you try to do. That's where you get stronger. And questioning is the same way. It's not the questions that you can answer easily that are the really good questions. You really want to reach a point where you're like, here's a question that I cannot answer. And you keep noodling it and you keep thinking about it and marinating it, and you just crack your head against it, to use a phrase that a friend used that I incorporate into the book. I think that's, if you can get yourself to that point, it's a wonderful intellectual experience.
So let's look at some of because we live in an age where there's so much certainty anymore in so many ways, and social media has, I know that it's easy to bash on social media. There's some good aspects to it, but it has facilitated, especially through algorithms, a reinforcement of an echo chamber where you have an assumption in your mind that everybody believes the exact same way I believe because I hear them all, because that's the only thing that's presented to me. I tell people, it used to be 5 years ago, the idea of moral relativism was a hot topic within apologetics. Now, nobody's talking about moral relativism anymore because everybody's so darn sure about who's evil, right? You go on a college campus and they'll tell you who's racist, who's evil, who's a Nazi. I mean, it's so cut and dry for most people today. So in that kind of a culture, how do we use these, and how can we leverage these for the kingdom's glory to kind of break through some of that, both inside the church, because I see it just as much in the church, as well as when engaging with our non-Christian friends and family?
Yeah, I think it's hard. It's really hard. Once you say something, the intoxication of applause is really hard to wean ourselves off of. And certainly social media, that's one of the effect it has, right? The counting of likes or retweets, right, as applause, like it reinforces things. So that's one danger. I mean, there's another danger on Twitter specifically where you have the reinforcement of being hated. You can sort of say something that's really controversial and get dunked on by all the
Ratioed,
quote, right people.
Yeah,
Like you get ratioed and you're like, and you're relevant for a moment because you got dunked on, and you've cultivated all these that are just boosting you in the algorithm and giving you more notoriety because and that's intoxicating in its own way, such that people start saying more and more risky things in order to sort of perpetuate that type of feedback loop. So there's feedback loops on each side. I mean, this is partly why I think opting out intellectually is massively important. I've quipped, I don't really trust anyone who doesn't take a substantive break from social media every year. So I leave social media entirely for Advent. So I get 4 weeks in December and then again for Lent. So I get about 6 weeks in the spring. And those two breaks dramatically transform my intellectual life. And I think it's really, really valuable. They preserve, I think, a sense of stability that I have lost in years past when I've not done those sorts of practices. But I do think that in ordinary environments where we have these types of echo chambers, um, there is some courage to ask. It does take a little courage to ask questions. It does. It does take a little boldness when everyone around you takes something as a given to say, are we sure about that? Can you just walk me through what the reasons are for it? Because even to ask that question when everyone else assumes they know what the answer is, when everyone else is very confident about what the right view is, even to ask that question is to make yourself an outsider. I mean, we mentioned Socrates, and this is very much Socrates' experience in Athens. He does ask questions. He's not a gadfly, I think, for being a gadfly's sake, but people think he is. And when I teach like the apology to my students, sometimes they find Socrates very annoying. And I understand why people find him annoying at times. He seems annoying, right? But there's a sense of alienation where he's a little bit like he's a stranger in Athens because he's willing to call into question what everyone else in the city takes as a given, takes as assumed, takes as the right answer. And it costs him. There's no doubt that those questions cost him. So I think that it does take some courage to ask questions, and it's valuable. I will say I think the litmus test for courage when it comes to questioning is questioning our own communities and questioning our own selves and what we think. In part because to ask a question of ourselves is to invite the possibility that our own identity, our own sense of rightness is wrong. Like we are called into question when we question ourselves. And that's a very hard thing for us to do. It's very hard to admit that we have been wrong about something, especially if you're the sort of person who's intellectually inclined. We have a lot at stake about being right, right? Like the paradox is the more intellectually inclined you are, the more you're going to be susceptible to attaching your identity to being right. And the harder it's going to get to question your own commitments. And so I think like in an environment like this, having the courage to question our own communities and our own commitments is really valuable, but really, really hard.
I was Sean McDowell had asked the question, how can you define or what's a good test for someone to know that they are a person who's truly seeking truth? What's a good test? And I offered the idea that if you could state well the premise and the reasons why a person holds a particular view, a view of which you disagree, without relying upon any kind of a straw man. I think that's a fairly good litmus test, because what it does is it shows that you've at least investigated their side to their satisfaction. All right, Aquinas was a master in doing this in his books. That's what he would do in his Summa. Here's what they're going to say. Here's all the reasons for it. Now, let me tell you why each one of these are wrong. But I think this idea of questioning yourself, at least giving a fair hearing, a fair investigation to the other side is part of that, because then it does do two things. It protects you from the straw man, and it also makes your arguments stronger and makes your questions better. You don't have to just say, well, I don't think that's true. So let's take some specific examples. Take, say, the whole transgenderism issue right now. Now, there's lots of questions all over the place for that. And for example, people say, well, what about pronouns? What should I do if someone tells me or asks me what my pronouns are? Can you use my pronouns? What should I say? And there's a lot of back and forth on that. My question usually is, why do you think they're your pronouns? What makes them yours? Because if I understand language correctly, Language is a shared construct within a community. It's something we all agree to, that certain items mean certain things. If you're changing the meaning of a word, regardless what that word is, and I have to know your meaning before I know what the word is, that's code. That's not language anymore. You're speaking in code. So sometimes answering or offering a question that's a little bit different than just, why do you think you're right? But how do you get to that? How do you get to the whole idea of ownership of language? Why would you even think language is something that you can own yourself? That pulls, I think, people in a third direction and kind of starts a conversation spinning in a new way.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. I mean, I like to say that creativity, intellectual creativity happens through friction, right? If you're going to just repeat all of your own answers to the questions you already have or the questions that other people are asking, but you're not going to take their questions very seriously or the ways in which they see things very seriously, you're going to stagnate intellectually. And if you look at the development of Christian orthodoxy, there's a real sense in which the development of Christian orthodoxy happens through repeated friction with those who end up being wrong in these important respects, right? Like the value, and Augustine will say this, the value of the heretics is that they force the church to clarify its own commitments and to grow in the understanding that Jesus promises he will lead the church into through the Holy Spirit, right? And I think you have to be open to really understanding those who you disagree with, to feel that sense of friction and to see that type of friction as its own benefit to your position, where it's not just, I'm going to prove you wrong. It's, as you say, my argument's going to be better here than it would have been otherwise. And so I'm not only going to be right, I'm going to be right in a more interesting way than I was before because I've taken what you have to say very seriously. And because it may be the case that the person that we disagree with sees something that we don't see, right? And so being open to their understanding of the world helps us, forces us to go deeper into our own account of the truth and holds us accountable to the truth. So I think that the way in which you describe that is really right. It's really valuable. I've sometimes tried to describe myself. I would like to be the most creative traditional thinker I know, right? Like that's the sort of like creative traditionalism where I'm saying what Lewis says, describes as the same old thing.
Right.
Changing. But we're figuring out ways in which we say the same old thing like Lewis did in really creative ways because the types of questions and the stakes for that message have changed. They're not the same as they were in Lewis's day or 200 years ago, et cetera.
Yeah, it's kind of tough to top Lewis or Chesterton or these guys who are so pithy and.
It's true.
It's
the education rough. We have, like their education is unparalleled. Like right,
yeah.
Like we're not going to recreate them because their learning from the time they were children is nothing like our learning.
Yeah, I agree exactly. So that I want to pull on this too because again, questioning, as you say, is not just gainsaying. It's not just questioning for everything. Although we hear a lot about this kind of critical thinking, critical questioning, right? We have critical theory and then critical race theory, and we have deconstruction, and you have a whole chapter in your book now to the deconstructing. This is the Emily that I was referring to earlier. Basically, Matt writes a letter to Emily about a deconstruction, a person he assumes a fictional character who's deconstructing her faith. And it's a definitely serious concern in the church today as we're seeing more and more visible celebrities, Christian celebrities, doing something like this. So tell me, first of all, how questioning is different than a critical theory approach to dismantling, and tell me a little bit more about the Emily letter.
Yeah. I think it's a really good question. The critical theory approach, and like I'm not immersed in the world of critical theory. It's not my area of expertise. Like many people, as it became into prominence, I went and read the brief introduction to critical theory. So, like there's aspects of like, so I just want to note my limits here in terms of what's at stake. And there's aspects of what I take the critical theorists to be doing to be really valuable. They are trying to push new questions into the forefront of people's consciousness that I think are worth asking. I remember sitting in a seminar, a legal seminar actually, which is where critical theory kind of originates. It's a legal theory. And um, this very traditional conservative lawyer, legal theorist specifically, asked, why is it the case that a if you ask about the O.J. Simpson trial, a huge number of white Americans think that O.J. Simpson, or at the time, was definitely guilty, right? And a huge percentage of Black Americans think he was definitely innocent. And what does it mean for him to get a fair trial if you have that sort of gap between those two communities in terms of how they understand that sort of case? And that's a question that I think is really worth asking. Wherever you stand on racial dynamics, how we theorize those in America, that's a question that when it comes to what happens in a court of law and trying to find the truth in a court of law, that's a question that I think you have to bring to the surface and have some account of that's valuable. So I think to that extent, I'm interested in what critical theorists are doing. I think what I would be hesitant about, and I have the same worries about deconstructionists, is the extent to which that becomes a program, right? Where that sort of question becomes the driving force for our intellectual lives, where we are unwilling or incapable of seeing the existing state of affairs and acknowledging and receiving the benefits that are present within them as goods. And so there's a sense in which if the critical theory or deconstructionist program is a kind of anti-tradition program, then it will dissolve underneath its own weight, because it turns out that you have to have some sort of inheritance intellectually that you regard as valuable and worthwhile to make your way through this world at all. You cannot deconstruct everything. You cannot see through everything, to use Lewis's type of language, right? You have to see along with something. And that means that you have to receive aspects of your inheritance, your intellectual inheritance, as valuable, as good, right? As the sort of thing that enables you to ask the questions that you have. So, in the sort of, I try not to keep up on certain aspects of the culture war, but you see these things about how the sort of graphs that go around that say, what's a sort of the heritage of colonialism? Well, logic, Western logic. If that's the case, that's a real problem. And what people who would think that misunderstand is that actually what allows them to make the critiques is logic, right? Like, and if they embrace that tool, they will make better and more interesting critiques of the world than they would be able to make otherwise. So I think that there's like, this is, like, I want to affirm the goods of a tradition while realizing that they're always mixed. But that means that I don't want a programmatic deconstruction or a programmatic, we're going to criticize everything until there's nothing left. There has to be something that we stop at where we say, no, here's what we think is true. And then we have to say something positive about what we're going to put in place about the world.
Yeah, and that's a piece of where it's missing. You notice that the deconstructionists never seem to want to deconstruct the presuppositions of deconstructionism itself. right?
Yeah.
Those seem to be tangential. But the bigger critique of it is it's always easier to critique and break down, but if you don't have anything, but they're and again, this out of the Frankfurt School and all of this, you get these guys who basically we need to wipe it all out because it's all biased, and then maybe something better will come along, right? Well, maybe something worse will come along. Maybe
Yeah.
this is the best we got. We don't know.
Yeah. And when it comes to deconstructionists, to the extent that they seem to be motivated by real pain, real experiences of suffering within Christian communities, I hate that. It breaks my heart. I also think Christianity is hard because all of that is built into the story. It's really hard to read the Old Testament and see the ways in which Israel goes right and goes wrong and think the church is going to be a pristine place without doing damage, right? And you think like the damage, it's built into the story because the church has not arrived at the eschaton yet.
It's built
And
into
you can
us.
say that's a problem, but it also might just mean that Christianity is true and that there are other alternatives for reconciling or dealing with the type of pain and damage that have been caused in these communities than throwing Christianity overboard.
Yeah. So okay, is the book out yet? Is it
The book will October 4th it
okay?
ships.
So right at the time, and we'll put a link to the book at the bottom of the YouTube video and all of that. What else did we miss, Matt? What else is needing to be addressed?
You're asking me to remember what's in my own book.
No, no, no. Just
That's a
in
hard...
general. What do we? What else has been on your mind even that you want to?
It's here's what I will say. I've been thinking a lot about. Well, I have a chapter in there called "A World Fit for Questions," and it's on how we discover the goods of creation through questioning. And I've been thinking a lot about. I took it out, I think, of this version. Augustine's first attempt at a commentary on Genesis, which just opens with a barrage of questions. Where Augustine, it's his first attempt, he abandons it. He writes a second commentary, a literal commentary on Genesis that is, he's got fewer questions and says more positive claims. But his first attempt just opens with this massive barrage of questions. And I think that that's a terrific stance to have towards the world. Because while I think there is such a thing as an order of creation, and I think there's a rightness and a wrongness about things and a truth and a falsehood, it's often very hard, much harder to discern within the world what those are than I think we want to acknowledge sometimes. And so I think questions are great because they remind us of some of those difficulties and because it's a strange and wonderful world and we get to think about it. It's great. It's a
Yeah.
great place to live.
Yeah, it does offer a level not only of humility, which is helpful, but you're not bearing a burden of proof either when you're asking questions. You're bearing, and again, you want to do it honestly as a point of inquiry. So that's great. So what's next then? What's next for you?
That's a fine question. So
I'm glad I got approval by the guy who wrote the book.
Well, so it's interesting because I was thinking about the critical theorists, and one of the things that I almost said is that they've mastered the art of suspicion, right? And we talk about the masters of suspicion, the Freud, Nietzsche, Marx sort of school, and the ways in which they have taken this category, suspicion, and turned it into a kind of virtue. Um, Classically, suspicion within the tradition of moral theology has been a vice. To suspect another of doing wrong when we don't have sufficient evidence, Aquinas says that's bad for the person who suspects, and it's bad for the person who is suspected. It's morally bad to think that someone else has done wrong. I'm thinking a lot about that as a problem, and thinking a lot about related questions in the ethics of reputation. How do we assess who we are, assess other people under conditions of uncertainty where we don't know each other firsthand? We're going off perceptions, and then we are going off of secondhand testimony, people's reputations. I think there's a whole range of questions that have been underdeveloped there in recent years that need serious attention.
It is a politically charged year. It's an election year, and that is pretty much exactly what you're going to see for the next 13 months.
Yep.
So.
It's all reputation management. And, we've also seen lots of scandals within the church, right? Within all the denominations and
parachurch ministries.
Parachurch ministries, right? Yeah. And they've had to make these decisions about what they say and do not say, and how they sort of manage, quote unquote, their own reputations, the reputations of their founders, leaders. And there isn't a lot of guidance. There's not a lot of resources on how to think about an ethics of reputation. So that's what I'm working on these days.
Interesting.
Make me even more fun at parties than I already am.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the other aspects I think that we need to bolster in the church on a completely different plane really is the theology of the body and theology. I think we've neglected it for so long that it's led to a lot of confusion in our modern culture, but we need to flesh that out as well. Anyway.
That was a good pun.
That's right.
You got to flesh out the theology of the body, That's Can't leave it as we need more than a skeleton theology of the body.
Yeah, they won't teach it at Berkeley, right? Is that the... Okay. I will stop now because you'll get me going. So thanks so much for spending your time. Again, the book is fascinating. I hope folks grab it. And will I see you in San Antonio in November?
I am going to be in San Antonio, I think, for 12 hours. So it's possible
so you can drive there and drive back, I guess.
I'm driving there, driving back. I've got to teach class. So I'm coming back to spend time questioning with undergraduates, which is, in my mind, superior to
maybe during that 12 hours we can get lunch. That would be great.
I love that.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, Matt. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you later.
Thank you much.
Okay. Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.